Any other bills? Seeing none, we'll move on to approval of the minutes from January 15, 16, 21, 22, and 23. Do we have a motion? Senator Fagg.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we accept the minutes as provided.
We have a motion. Do we have a second? Senator Peterson seconds. Is there any questions or anything on the minutes? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? No. Motion carries. Committee, we're going to have our annual presentation from Alan Conroy on the CAPERS status. Alan, Executive Director of CAPERS. Welcome to committee, Alan.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. And certainly pleased to spend a few minutes with you, bringing you up to date a little bit on some of the CAPERS information, and we'll just proceed on with the presentation, I think. Just remind you, of course, if you don't have it, there's my contact information should you need help with any CAPERS issues during the session, my desk phone, cell phone, and of course my email. Just a reminder, of course, CAPERS really is, we use that generic term, but really it's really made up of 3 different retirement systems. The regular CAPERS system, so state, school, and local members, police and fire, so public safety officers, which include EMS people for those employers that have decided to affiliate for public safety. Just might comment there in terms of, particularly at the local level, like sheriff's departments, maybe some cities, the governing body would have to elect to move into police and fire. So there are a number of law enforcement officers around the state that are in regular CAPERS and not in police and fire. And then the retirement system for judges, which are the state judges, district magistrate judges, district court judges, appellate court judges, and of course, the Supreme Court. And then there's 1,500 employers spread around the state, of course, state of Kansas, all the school districts, all the counties, almost all the cities. City of Wichita is the exception where they're large enough to have their own retirement system. But then you get into all those special purpose districts like the community colleges, conservation districts, drainage districts, townships, public hospitals, and on down the list. Of course, CAPERS is governed by a 9-member board of trustees, 4 appointed by the governor, subject to confirmation by the Senate, 1 appointed by the president of the Senate, and the current appointee of the president's is Sam Williams from Wichita, retired chief financial officer and former secretary of revenue. Our newest trustee is Rich Prale, an appointee of the speaker, former House member from Parsons, and he's a retired banker, so he has that banking background. And so, and then the members get to elect 2, one on the school side, one on the non-school side, and then the state treasurer, by virtue of that office, is the ninth member of the Board of Trustees. Just in terms of the membership, you know, and again, just the magnitude of the CAPERS Trust Fund with over $28 billion in assets. We have over 335,000 total members, and that'd be retired, active, and inactive. So literally almost 1 in every 11 Kansan has a direct connection to CAPERS. So we touch a lot of lives, and certainly those public servants are counting on us to do our job in terms of providing that retirement benefit that they've earned and paid into when they get ready to retire. Also, of course, the state, the CAPERS obligation is a big commitment on behalf of the state. Over $750 million annually comes from the state. And again, the state, of course, would pay the employer contribution for all state employees. But just a reminder, the state pays the employer contribution for all local school employees as well as part of state aid to education. So that amounts to almost $665,000, and then there's pension obligation bond payments that we'll talk about in a minute that would be on top of that, that gets you even higher. So a great deal of state resources flow to the retirement fund to pay those future benefits, current and future benefits of our members. As we look at the active members, of course, as you might expect, the largest group is the school member group, with over 56% are school members, followed by local, state, then KPNF, and then judges. So, but yeah, 154,000 Kansans that are actively working and are active members of KPERS. And then as we looked, then in KPERS 3, you may remember there's KPERS 1, 2, and 3, based on when the member joined. Our largest group now is that KPERS 3 with almost 80,000 members. And that's for people who joined the system on January 1st, 2015 or later. So it's been in place about 10 years. And as we look at some numbers, you can see, I think, the amount of people that sort of come and go in the public sector, retire or leave for other employment opportunities, I guess. But anyway, largest group, KPERS 3, again, with 80,000. KPERS 2, about 23,000. That's for membership from 2009 to 2014. And then anybody that joined before 2009 would be in KPERS 1, and there's about 43,000 of those. Just in terms of average benefit, for KPERS members, it's about 10 years. Final average salary, or their salary right now averages about 51,000. Police and fire, it's also over just a little over 10 years with an average salary of 80,000, and then judges at 9.3% or 9.3 years and $127,000. And just a quick note, KPERS 1, in terms of the retirement eligibility provisions, KPERS 1, it's age 65 with 1 year, age 62 with 10, or 85 points. And that's when age and years of service equal 85, the person is eligible for normal retirement. Of course, they don't have to, but they would be able to do that. KPERS 2 and 3 is age 65 with 5 years, or age 60 with 30 years. Police and fire, just mentioned, they can, depending on years of service, they can retire 50, 55, or 60, again, 25 years, 20, or 15 years. But again, just that the public policy decision to have a young, vigorous workforce in terms of the public safety employees, and so it allows for earlier retirement there. On slide 5 then is just the active membership, and it just kind of a busy thing, but the graph, the bar chart on the left then shows that the blue part then are the KPERS 3 member. You can see there's more of those on the left. Of course, the newer members since 2015. KPERS 1 members are the green part on the graph, more to the right, which of course more seniority as well. And I think I've mentioned before, but our oldest active member is a 91-year-old school employee. On the service distribution side, again, if you think about it, 2015 for KPERS 3, that 0 to 5 is almost all KPERS 3 members, and then 5 to 10 years, mainly KPERS 3 members. The KPERS 1 members, again, skewed to the right of that graph. Our oldest, our current employee with the longest tenure, longest service, is a state employee with 56 years of service. And I was just guessing might be a KDOT employee. They have a lot of service, like the female teachers on the school side. KDOT employees on the state side have a great deal of seniority. As we look to membership then, for retirees, then we have about 116,000 retirees. And again, our longest, our retiree that's oldest right now is 109. And again, we do happen to know that's a school female employee as well. Beneficiaries up from 15 up to 107 years of age. Again, as you'd expect, the pie chart on the right, with our largest active members, our retirees, the largest group is school as well, with over 62,000 CAPER school members, about 54% of the 116,000 retirees. The average benefit for CAPERS members, about a little less than $17,000 a year, about $1,400 a month. Police and fire, the benefits about $43,000, and judges about $48,000 a year. And again, most of these systems then are in conjunction, assume that Social Security there is part of it. Of course, on the police and fire, there's some groups that are not affiliated with Social Security. That decision was made, of course, decades ago. And at the state level, the Kansas troopers and the KBI agents are not affiliated with Social Security. So they have the police and fire benefit, as well as of course, any personal savings. And just the note about 88% of the retirement benefits are paid to people that remain in Kansas once they retire. And then just a couple of these quick county charts of our state. Again, it's just the heat map, so the darker the color, the more number of retirees. And of course, Johnson, Sedgwick, and Shawnee, I believe, are the three highest number of retirees, and you can see those numbers for each of the counties spread across the state. And then the next pie chart just looks at the average monthly benefits of retirees in Kansas. Again, it's just the dollar. Again, the darker the shading, the higher the average monthly benefit for retirees. And so Johnson at about $1,900 a month, Douglas at $1,800 a month, Wyandotte also around just a little less than $1,900 a month. As we look to funding, and of course that's been a discussion point through the history of CAPERS in terms of adequate funding and funded ratio. And the funded ratio is just assets to liabilities. And this is a kind of a busy, long historical funding chart going back to 1993. And you can see back in 1993, the system was 82% funded. Funded ratios, again, assets, liabilities, of course, you want to be 100% funded. At a minimum, you want to be over 80% funded, and that's so when there's particularly a downturn in the stock market and investments that you can weather that downturn. And so you can see that green kind of squiggly line going across the sort of the top of the page where that funded ratio was 82%. And then if you look about 2012, it got down to 56%, which was the lowest in terms of that funded ratio. The actuarial assets are the orange across the bottom, and then that unfunded liability is the blue, and you can see that has increased as well through the years. The funded ratio, particularly in 2012, when it got down to 56%, and of course, if you look at the decade before that, there were two major downturns in the stock market, 2003, 2004, 2008, 2009. And at that point, of course, and beyond that, there were 25 years where the state made the decision, the policymakers at the time, to contribute less than the actuarially required amount. And I think I've discussed, every year the actuary says the contribution should be at a certain level, and then for those 25 years, the decision was made for budgetary purposes to contribute something less than that. And that difference between the actuarially required and the actual payments just roll to the unfunded liability. We charge our assumed 7% right now, and so that just increases that unfunded liability. And it's the classic pay me now, pay me later kind of thing. But to the credit to really the policymakers and governors, legislators, certainly since 2012, a lot has happened. Certainly the creation of KPERS 3, which by plan design costs less than KPERS 1 or 2 on the employer side, and there's some shared risk between the employees and the employers. There were pension obligation bonds sold, where the state interest arbitrage bonds, where the state sold those bonds, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. But pension obligation bonds were sold, and then the state made some additional payments just cash payments to the trust fund to help pay down the unfunded actuarial liability. So, and then perhaps most important, maybe of them all, is for the last now 7 valuations, the state, legislature, the governor have paid exactly what the actuary said. So there's no sort of underfunding, paying exactly. The actuary says contribute at this part, and the policymakers, you all have done that. And that's probably the single biggest key to long-term funding of the system, is just paying what's the required amount. And so that has been achieved. And you can see that squiggly green line is now the overall system's at 74%, and it's headed in the right direction. And that's probably, again, pension funding usually doesn't change on a dime, and so it's very directional, takes a very long time for changes to play out. But we can see that funded ratio on towards getting closer to that interim goal of 80% funded, on the way then to 100% funded. So from that low point, in 2012, a lot of progress has been made over the last little more than a decade. As we look to just the most recent actuarial evaluation, again, some good news there. On that funded ratio, 73.4 to 74%. There was a slight uptick in the unfunded liability. Still working through the loss in 2022, I guess it was, the valuation there. But just in terms of returns for calendar year 2023, which the valuation's based on, and that's the latest one, the return was 10.6%. Again, that state school group of the bigger funded ratio part is at 75.2. And so certainly some good news there in terms of that progress. And just the reminder in terms of those contribution rates, again, at the actuarially determined rate, but that state still contribution rate in the current year is 11.5% of the covered payroll. And then, of course, you add Social Security on top of that. So certainly a commitment towards the benefit of public employees. This one is even busier yet, but just call out a few things. This is the funding improvement, and there's a group, state level government retirement plans data that we watch and monitor. But over the last 10 years, the KPERS funded ratio has improved about 17%. And so if you look at those last 10 years, we're the 11th highest improved among state level plans. So that's a good thing. And the KPERS is that orange bar kind of to the far right. The other non-green ones, then we have shaded in some of the Missouri plans, the Oklahoma plans, the Colorado plans, and Nebraska. And then you can see how KPERS is doing. But I think, again, it's in a really confirmation, validation of the work that policymakers have done over the last 10 years to help improve the funded ratio of KPERS. Just to note, the one that's proved the most, in case you're interested, is the Indiana teachers system. They've done a lot there. And then on the other end, The one that's done the worst over the last 10 years is a small California retirement plan, not CalSTRS or CalPERS, not the big teachers or the big public employees, but they have a number of retirement plans, and it's just one of those small ones that's struggled in terms of funding. But I think, again, this is 11th highest improved over the last 10 years. Again, that's certainly good news and certainly good to see that. As we look at investment performance, again, over half of the money from the trust fund comes from KPERS investments. So it's certainly important, as the trust fund, as the market goes up and down, and of course, we're not all in the stock market. We're $28 billion. We're a well-diversified fund, so bonds and corporate debt and real estate and timber and on down the list, alternative investments to try to weather any big downturns. But certainly we watch what happens on a daily basis, but clearly we're not day traders. And then about a third from employer contributions, and then the balance from the member contributions. Just looking at calendar year 2024, the return was 9.3%, which is, of course, a good thing. Again, that assumed rate is 7% is the target. And if you look over experience over time, our 20-year return is at 7.3. The 25-year return is 6.9, and then our 30-year return is 8.4%. And again, the graphic on the bottom right just shows how the assets in the trust fund have doubled in the last 2 decades, from $9.8 billion to over $26 billion in 23 to now almost $24 billion in 2024. And again, the 20-year return, that we're at 7.3. Again, that target is 7%. This just looks at those historical fiscal year returns. Again, you can see that 2008, 2009, when the market took the nosedive and the trust fund, the value of it went down almost 20%. And so that's a perfect example of why you want that funded ratio to be something certainly higher than 56%. And that's why you want to be at a minimum over 80% on your way to 100. That dotted line across is that assumed rate. It's currently at 7%. But you can see then going back since 1998, let's see, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There were 11 years then since that time where we were less than the assumed rate, and then the balance then we were able to do that. But again, I think most people, it's just not if there'll be another market downturn, it's when it's going to come, and that's why we want that. It's helpful to have that funded ratio as high and as strong as possible. On slide 14, then I'd mentioned those bond performances. Again, since some efforts then with the policymakers to help improve that funded ratio. So the state sold 3 different times, sold pension obligation bonds. So the state sold the bonds, the state pays the debt service, KPERS got the bond proceeds for us to invest. It's really just interest arbitrage. So the assumption is that we'll take those bond proceeds, we'll invest them in the portfolio, and we'll earn more in those investments, those returns, higher than what the state has to pay as debt service. So the higher the trust fund is, the lower the employer contributions are. And so far those 3 bonds, that interest arbitrage assumption has worked. And as you look there in 2004, there were bonds sold at the interest rate of 5.39%. And on that money, we've earned 7.5%. And so after taking out the debt service on those bonds, we're to the good collectively of $658 million. So again, the state's paying the debt service. You subtract that out, the KPERS, the net then is at $655 million. Debt service on those bonds is $33 million a year from the expanded lottery gaming revenue. And so that one comes from that source. The other two bonds, the debt service comes right from the general fund. That bond in 2015, it was $1 billion, so $1 billion with a B. And the bond costs there were at 4.68%. We've earned on that about 7.8%. And so there we're to the good $465 million. Debt service, again, the state's paying is $65 million annually from the state general fund. And so that has worked out. And then the last one in 2021, it was $500 million in bonds that were sold at an interest cost of 2.65%. Since that time, we've earned 3.85%, so about $20 million on that money. Debt service is $24 million annually as well. And so even though, I guess this is another part where the state is making, in effect, contributions to support CAPERS. So the $650 million annually in employer contributions, certainly a big amount, but then there's this $33 million from expanded lottery, and then almost $90 million from the general fund that's outside of the CAPERS fund, but it's really to the benefit of CAPERS because it's that debt service. And then just on the bonds, then they're 30-year bonds, so a lot can happen up or down in those 30-year bond numbers, but certainly so far, again, and some of these bonds, of course, have been around for a while, some not so long, but collectively right now we're to the good of $1.1 billion after paying the debt service. So that's, so far they've worked as certainly as anticipated or as hoped. And then just a couple times, the state has made some additional just payments out of the general fund that I mentioned directly to CAPERS to pay down the unfunded liability. And there's in 2022, there was a $1.125 billion additional payment. Part of that was to pay for some delayed employer contributions in 2017 and 2019, $250 million. And then $870 million was paid down directly to the unfunded actuarial liability. It was applied to the school group. It improved the school funded ratio by 5%. And today, as I mentioned, it's the school group 75% funded. And at the time, it reduced the employer contributions by almost, not quite 1%, but about $45 million at the time for that additional payment. And then I might just add, there's been discussions, of course, in terms of some additional payments into the trust fund to pay down that obligation, to pay down that debt. And there's just a chart there on 16 that shows some additional funding of $100 million, $250 million, $500 million, or $1 billion, a round number. But just how that impacts us. So that $1 billion, for example, based on the current funded ratio, it would increase it almost 4%. So get you close to 79%, get you that much closer to that 80%. And then, of course, again, as that funded ratio is higher, the annual employer contribution rates would be less. So in that case, the employer contribution based on these assumptions would be $72 million less every year. So, over 5 years, you're getting close to almost $400 million in lower employer contributions based on that payment. So it certainly helps the unfunded liability, improves that funded ratio, any amount of additional payment to go to address the debt. And maybe, Mr. Chairman, it's a lot of information, but I will stop at that point and be glad to respond to any questions as appropriate.
Thank you, Alan. You did drop a sheet off at my office a few days back, and I think it showed on there that the return for this year was like 1.6 billion. Is that close?
Yes, that's right. In the last calendar year, that's how much the trust fund has increased. It's I don't know. To me, that's amazing that there can be that much change up or down, but certainly this year it's great because it's up that amount.
I didn't see that on here, and I just wanted to make sure that the committee knew that we had one heck of a year last year as far as returns. Committee questions, Senator Alley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. When you go back to your historical returns, we see in 21, we got 26%. And I don't, what caused that?
Certainly what was going on with the market at the time, and a lot of times you'll see, I think it's even, when there's a downturn in the market one year, then there's that rally and that rebound. And so as you look, I mean, that's an example. But yeah, once that sort of pent up anticipation on the market that, okay, now we're past the bad time and now we're going to invest and go all in, and the returns can be really pretty dramatic, and that's certainly what reflects
Sure,
happened.
that more often.
Yes.
Senator Cluse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Alan. You bring a wealth of knowledge. I want to ask a couple questions around the investment portfolio. I've been getting a lot of emails, and of course, I think in another meeting you were in, you talked about when we pulled the funds out of China, we didn't lose the money, and there was a lot of debate whether or not that was going to happen or not. And so, yay that we didn't lose that. But getting a lot of emails and with possibility of Bill coming forward, investing in Bitcoin, and a lot of retired teachers have been reaching out to me vastly against this. I don't know if this is a point that you could share, educate, help us on this a little bit, or what your thoughts are.
Well, maybe just a few general thoughts. Certainly in terms of the investment allocation, the board trustees, they set out their investment allocation. So it's the guideline for our investment managers really over the next 3 or 4 years. And again, it's well diversified. So if stock markets go up, we open bonds or real estate, whatever, will go the other way. But on Bitcoin, and part of that is all driven by whether it's Bitcoin or anything else in terms of course, trying to get the highest return with the least amount of risk. And that's probably, I think, a decision for the board, which currently they could make, is in terms of how much risk do they want to take on to invest in, that type of investment. And so far, they've made the decision to not do that. And of course, some of the returns, short-term returns, are pretty enticing, certainly interesting to watch. But on the risk side, and again, for a pension fund, we have this 30 to 40 year investment horizon. And so we're, I'd say, kind of risk adverse. Take some, but I think a reasonable amount of risk.
Senator Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Alan, for being here. Excuse me, a number of organizations seem to be coming into my office advocating that we roll back from KPERS 3 to KPERS 2 due to just a lot of disappointment with what that is looking like long-term for their retirees. Do you have any idea what something like that would cost in the event that we did that?
Some general numbers, I think, based on a bill that was introduced last year that would have actually done that. So would have closed KPERS 3, everybody would go back to KPERS 2, and all new employees would be in KPERS 2. The increase in the unfunded liability is about $440 million. And then the increased annual additional employer contributions, about $65 million to do that. And of course, every year, again, KPERS 3 is the largest group. All the new employees that are coming in the system are KPERS 3. So every year, that cost, that group, that if you wanted to do it, 5 years from now, it's even going to be higher, of course, because the group that you're going to roll back would be, of course, that much larger.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Conroy, for your presentation. Looking at the funding improvement by the other states, so Missouri beats us, Nebraska beats us, and you said Indiana was tops, if I remember right. What was their secret to what they did to improve? Did they pay down, or did they have great investments, or did anybody ever look into that?
I think, well, I know, for example, on their funding, Nebraska's always paid what they were supposed to. So for 25 years, there haven't been any, I guess, less than the required funding. I think, I guess maybe we need to do some more analysis, but. Right, that's true. Speaking of risk, I do know the Indiana system, as Jared just reminded me, they were pretty into alternatives investments. And so again, right now the return's pretty good, but the risk is also pretty good as well in terms of high. So that's a pretty good example there.
And, Alan, I was wondering, when we say capers 1, 2, and 3, we had capers 1, we couldn't afford that at one time, so we went to a 2. We couldn't afford that, so we went to a 3. So as we talk about going back to 2, there's a reason for that. Is that true?
That's correct. I think both when Capers 2 was created and Capers 3, it was during funding difficulties of the state and looking forward to the long-term obligation towards Capers at the time and trying to reduce or minimize that.
And a follow-up question. You didn't talk about smoothing, but this great year last year will help us with smoothing as we go forward in the program.
That's correct. Our actuary, in terms of when she does her calculations, there's an actuarial smoothing valuation amount. So they take the gain or loss and factor that in over 5 years, and it's to help sort of stabilize. So employer contributions. So if you had a really good or a bad year, the employer contributions, if it wasn't smooth, could go up a lot. And so that spread, good or bad experiences spread out over 5 years in that calculation of setting the employer contribution rate.
Senator Petty.
As always, Alan, it's great to have you here. So if I look back at the historical funding, and so probably would this be correct that the thing that's had the biggest impact on our funding ratio is not paying our portion?
I believe that's correct. That was that 25 years of paying less than what was required.
And so when we look at that, when we look at this graph, and so are you able to discern how long it takes for us to recover when we don't pay, or is it determined? I mean, I know we've now been paying our portion, and we put in extra funds, but is it actually, are you able to see how long it takes, or is this just looking at this graph?
Well, I mean, I guess if you assume that 7% return, even to pay off the unfunded liability, right now it's 2039. So that's the time frame in terms of paying off that unfunded actuarial liability, to have that extinguished by 2039. And so, again, with the 7% assumption on the investment side, we should be able to get that. And the longer that the required amount is paid, then that just helps the funded ratio that much more.
So if we, Mr. Chairman, so if we see that big dip in, I think it's 2008, if we had actually been, so would we be at that 86%?
I believe, yes, and I think we'd done some previous analysis a few years ago, but I guess had that 25 years of less than required payments, I think clearly we would be over 80% funded now, and maybe getting closer to 90% funded, but I don't think we'd be quite to 100, but maybe 85% funded, or maybe a little higher.
And then with the Capers 3, there is a big difference between Capers 2 and Capers 3 as far as when it comes to, I think you referred to it, that as far as maintaining employees, or they're looking at their long-term investment for their retirement.
That's correct. Capers 3 is a cash balance plan. There's shared risk between the employer and the employee. It's not all on the employer like Capers 1 and Capers 2. Part of the reason it's less expensive for the employer by design in 2012 when it was set up. But I do always point out in terms of Capers 3 members, it is a cash balance plan, so it's not that traditional true defined benefit plan like 1 and 2. Technically a defined benefit plan by our IRS friends. But don't forget, Capers 3 members, they never, and so a lot of times it's compared to a 401k. Capers 3 members never lose what they put in. They're guaranteed 4% interest at a minimum, and if the trust fund does better, they can get dividends on top of that. And then third, they're guaranteed a lifetime benefit, because whatever's in their notational account, as it's called, when they get ready to retire, Capers 3 members, it's annuitized, and it's paid then, it's guaranteed for the rest of their lifetime. Unlike a 401k, of course, whatever you have in there, if you spend it, then it's gone. If you retire at a time the market's down, that could have an impact, but there's certainly, when you compare 401k to Capers 3, those three, I think, strengths of the Capers 3 system shouldn't be overlooked.
Just last, Mr. Chairman, I always get a little bit confused. So with Capers 3, so is everybody who's coming in on Capers 3, whether they're in police and fire, or whether they're judges, or whether they're state employees?
It'd just be police and fire, and judges have their own retirement system, so they don't have like a Capers 3, a cash balance plan. It'd be only the regular Capers people that would be in that cash balance plan, that Capers 3. And then there is one exception. Capers correctional officers remain in Capers 2. So if a new Capers correctional officer is hired today, they don't go in Capers 3, they go in Capers 2, and that was a policy decision made by the legislature.
We've passed specific legislation. And lastly, with the Social Security, didn't we have some people that would have been impacted by not being able to originally draw their Social Security, and now with some federal changes?
That's right. There's particularly in the public safety area, some of those groups are not affiliated with Social Security, or depending on when they paid in. And again, state troopers, KBI agents do not belong to Social Security, and that decision was made decades ago. But you're right, there was just federal legislation that was just signed first of the year, I guess, the end of December, that because there was some offset in terms of Social Security benefits and the eligibility for those based for certain public safety employees. But anyway, that federal legislation has done away with, I think in almost all cases, with that offset. So those public safety officers have had Social Security offset. That will no longer happen.
Thank you.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you answered my question. I was trying to remember the rate for Tier 3 of Capers at 4%. So you answered my question. Thank you.
Other questions? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Conroy, the Capers 3 retirees benefit is a defined benefit. So whatever they retire at, it stays at that the rest of their life, just like 2 and 1?
That is correct. Capers 3 members do, if they want to self-fund a cost of living adjustment, they can pick 1 or 2%, which would lower, so then it's on an actuarial calculation, it lowers their monthly benefit, but then they get that cost of living adjustment on down the road. So, but generally, it's just like 1, 2, and 3. There's not been, a cost of living adjustment, and so whatever they retire, that's what they're going to get for the rest of their life.
On page 10, the funded ratio at the end of 22 was 73.4. The end of 23 was 74, which is higher, but the unfunded actuarial liability dollar amount is higher as well. Is that just simply because the fund is a larger amount.
Yeah, it's kind of gets back to that, that smoothing, because in 2022 was a rough year for the trust fund just in December. Of course, then it bounced back in January, but the calculations on the end of December. And so when that actuary did the calculation, so there's some big negative numbers being smoothed out over 5 years. And so it was just kind of that next bite of the apple from that down year that just worked out enough to tip it. So the unfunded liability, it did increase by about 100 million.
Well, when you look at those numbers, it just looks a little strange without the explanation. Thank you.
Any other questions? Alan, I've got one other one. On your chart on page 9, we did hit 80%. What year was that? And your chart doesn't show that, before they reamortized.
Oh, yes, we were within shouting distance, the high 79%, 78, almost 79%. It was the assumption, but the board made that change. You're exactly right. And now that's been 3 years ago. Yeah, 2020. So I guess 5 years ago, where they went, because it had been at 7.75, and the board made the decision to reduce it to 7%. And so that assumes then, of course, as you're looking out 30 or 40 years, if you assume that rate of return on the trust fund is now 7% versus 7.75, that increased the unfunded liability in that year as well.
And more importantly, it lowered the amount that each agency contributes. That's part of the whole problem. You know, it's, if everything would have been funded as it should have been correctly, we wouldn't be putting these extra dollars in to try to catch up. I mean, it would be paying for itself. Just like last year, 1.6 billion, and we pay out just a little over 2 something.
Yeah, $2 billion a year in benefits of all types. Yes.
So we're almost, last year was to where our return on investments took care of the payouts. It didn't quite, but almost. I mean, and thank you for pointing out the Capers 3, because anyone else that goes to a job today and they get a 401k, there is no 4% guarantee, and there isn't the accelerator, and there isn't the guarantee at the end. I mean, it's a pretty good deal, really. So, any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Alan. Appreciate it. Committee, that concludes our work for today. We are adjourned.